Hi, good evening. My name is Rachel Nelson. I'm the Director of Educational Initiatives and Intergroup Outreach at the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland. Welcome and thank you for joining us this evening. In this time of national and local reckoning with our country and city's grim legacy of discrimination and hate, we've come together as a broad coalition of friends and allies to create a series of public programs to confront hate. We've been reminded almost daily that our communities of color, immigrants, and LGBTQ persons, as well as many of our neighbors of various religious faiths, are frequent targets of vicious hatred. Nevertheless, we've also seen seeds of hope. We've witnessed an upsurge of people ready to stand in solidarity with those who are targets of hate and discrimination, people who are eager to listen, to learn, and to take action to make Portland a place that truly protects the lives, well-being, and dignity of all who lives here. We are currently hosting webinars representing the people who have historically and continually been targets of discrimination and hatred in Oregon. These webinars are presented by a broad group of organizations and speakers in our Greater Portland community. This is our fourth of our 6 webinars. Please join us on February 23rd to learn about the hidden history of anti-Asian discrimination in Oregon, and on March 18th to learn about the hidden history of Jews and anti-Semitism in Oregon. You can register for these as well as see recordings of our previous webinars online at www.jewishportland.org/uncovering. I'll put that in the chat. You'll also be able to find tonight's recording there as well. This is all going to culminate in a half-day virtual summit on May 26th on confronting hate in Oregon, featuring keynotes and breakout sessions on a variety of topics. Stay tuned for more information. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to use the Q&A feature to ask questions, and there will be a time at the end to have them answered. Please note that the chat feature has been disabled. At this time, I'd like to introduce Robin Will, who is the president of GLAPN.
Well, thanks, Rachel. I'm happy to be doing this. I'm really grateful for the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland for pulling this together. It's important for us to address the issues of hate in all the ways in the community that we can. GLAPN, by the way, I am president of GLAPN, GLAPN, Gay and Lesbian Archives of the Pacific Northwest. We're the only working historical society complete with archives and outreach that I know of personally right now. People can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're the only one working right now between San Francisco and Boise. We've got people with us tonight who have participated in the community over the last 30 or 40 years, who have had leadership positions in our community and region-wide. And I am going to let them introduce themselves, starting with Reid Vandenberg.
Well, thank you, Robin. Sorry, got to open my script here. I wear a couple of different hats this evening. From the mid-'70s to the mid-'90s, I was centered in the lesbian community here in Portland, and I was a founding member of the Portland Lesbian Choir in 1986. Who knew then that 20 years later, I'd be singing with the Portland Gay Men's Chorus, as I still do today. I began transition in 1995 and subsequently became a therapist, focusing on working with trans and non-binary clients. I retired from practice in 2012 to focus on writing and teaching. In 2014, I joined the board of the Portland PFLAG chapter. And that's me.
Hey, Robin, I think you were turning it over to me perhaps, so I'll go next. I'm Gina Frizzini. I'm currently the Director of Philanthropic Partnerships with Forward Together, which is a national women of color-led network of over 200 organizations working at the intersection of race, gender, and sexuality. We have a team here in Oregon as well as folks in about 10 other states. But today I'm here. I previously served as the Executive Director of Basic Rights Oregon. I was on staff there from 2005 to 2016 and served on the board from 2000 to 2005. Basic Rights Oregon is our state's LGBTQ advocacy organization. And I live in North Portland with my beloved, with our 2 teenage boys and a little terrier who's got a big bark that you may hear at some point during the presentation. I'll pass it to Deborah.
Thanks, Gina. My name is Deborah Porta, and I'm the Executive Director of Pride Northwest, best known for the annual Portland Pride Waterfront Festival and Parade. I have been in this position since late 2016, but prior to that, I served as the President of the Board of Directors from 2007 to the end of 2015. I am originally from Dallas, Texas. I moved to Oregon in 1997, which from what I understand makes it legal for me to claim to be an Oregonian now. My background is in, of all things, customer service, higher education, and restaurant. And when I returned to college in my mid-30s, I became involved with Pride Northwest as a volunteer, and that charted the rest of my career, basically. My wife and I have been together since 2007. We've been married since late 2013, and we live with our four-legged friends in North Portland. And that's me.
You're on mute,
You're
Robin.
muted, Robin. You're muted.
Unmute. There we go. We're talking about the history of hate and where queer people, where LGBTQ people are concerned. That seems to have gone back, to the beginnings of time in Western culture. It has always been sort of a matter of social class because popes and kings and princes have had their boys on the side. But somehow for the common people, it never quite worked that way. And we don't know a whole lot about gay women in history. We know that Pope so-and-so had boys on the side. Women weren't franchised. They didn't have economic independence. It takes a fairly shrewd scholar to figure out who was lesbian in the olden days, because they didn't have a voice. They didn't have a voice. They weren't noticed, or they weren't hated as much as gay men were hated. In Oregon, in our lifetimes, we had a sodomy law beginning just from statehood, as a matter of fact, which was used as an excuse to persecute gay men, in any way that they could. The sodomy law got comical because every once in a while the legislature would add to it. So eventually it got to the point that almost everything was considered sodomy, except missionary positions, sex with your married spouse, and even soliciting to commit sodomy was considered sodomy under the definition of the law. And that was kind of funny, except that it was a felony, 5 to 15 years in the state penitentiary, and automatic referral to the state eugenics board for sterilization. That went on. I think they stopped sterilizing guys in the 1950s, but we're not quite sure. All of the state eugenics board records were destroyed in the early 2000s, shortly before Governor Kitzhaber issued an apology to everyone, because the state was sterilizing a lot of people at that point. The gay men, of course, but certainly the Reform School, Hillcrest School for Girls, and also Fairview Home for the Mentally Retarded, and also the state insane asylums. People were getting sterilized right and left. Governor Kitzhaber apologized for all that in 2002. So we no longer know who was sterilized for being gay because the records don't exist. Sodomy law went away in Oregon in 1972 with the revised criminal code. It was replaced by something really odious. They had to throw a bone to conservatives. They raised the age of consent from 16 to 18, and there's a really ugly statute forbidding solicitation for deviant purposes, which was a bad enough law that it was struck down by the courts in 1981. That meant that, you know, for gay men and for for women that were visible, that we were first of all, we were religious pariahs, and everyone knew that. Second of all, we were criminals by definition. And the third, to make it a triple whammy, homosexuality was, you know, in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual as a mental illness until 1973. At least, you know, people who wanted to change, people who were unhappy with their homosexuality. That wasn't such a big deal for grown-ups who had a choice about what they did, but it was certainly a problem for young people who could be committed to state mental hospitals because they were queer, because they were gay, they'd come out to their parents. And I am like 2 degrees of separation away from a young man who, well, he was young then, he couch surfed most of the summer before his 18th birthday because he overheard his parents talking about having him lobotomized to cure his homosexuality. That was the kind of situation that we were in 1970 when the Gay Liberation Front started meeting in Portland. It was enormously brave because I'm wondering now if that many, you know, I'm wondering that now if that many people gay people had ever gathered in Portland in a church basement before. It was revolutionary in a lot of ways, trying to organize a community where actually none had existed, make a little room for themselves, and start working on whatever gay liberation meant at the time. They went, you know, our community hasn't ever hung together a whole lot, and so they started off in several different directions. Some of the women's separatists got busy in very basic community work. Cindy Comfer became an attorney and did a lot of early work on domestic partnerships, adoptions, and she was one of the founders of the Gay Women's Caucus politically. Catherine English settled the first, another attorney, settled the first contested lesbian child custody suit. We were fighting in every direction, trying to make room for ourselves. Some of the people, a lot of the men and some of the women, decided that political action was the way to go, and started lobbying every place they could for gay rights. In 1973, George Nicola wrote the first civil rights bill and lobbied for it in the state legislature. They stuck in the House of Representatives, 2 votes short of a majority. And it was introduced year after year after that. The Oregon Equality Bill finally passed in 2008. Through the 70s, they began doing just whatever they could do. In 1974, Mayor Connie McCready initiated a resolution to ban discrimination in city government. In 1974, Neil Goldschmidt refused to issue a Pride proclamation. He didn't do that until 1977, and and when he did it, a group of citizens immediately started a recall election against him. PFLAG Portland finally got some airtime. It was when PFLAG had been around, you know, in organizational phases for a couple of years before that, but they were trying to gain membership support group for parents of gay kids. And Ann Shepard, who had been a reporter at the Journal, tried to run a classified ad in the Journal saying, parents of gays, would you like to meet? Would you like to talk? Form a support group. And the Journal wouldn't print it because they were a family newspaper. That was advertising for parents of gays was way too much. They got on TV in 1977. And after that, Portland PFLAG just never stopped. The Northwest Gender Alliance began in 1980. Through the late 60s, early 70s, Portland had been, because of personnel at in the psychiatric department at OHSU, Oregon Health Sciences University. There'd been some pioneering work done with transgender folks there. And Northwest Gender Alliance began in 1980. And in the 80s, a variety of community groups started putting together packages, programs where you could find a gay-friendly therapist and a gay-friendly doctor so that you didn't need to walk in cold to a doctor who hated your guts. In 1988, Phoenix Rising, which was one of those programs, actually qualified to get into the United Way. They got United Way dollars for the first time. They had that much respect for what they were doing. And in 1988, also Governor Goldschmidt, who had had a change of heart along the way, issued an executive order banning discrimination by sexuality in state employment. As we got stronger as a community, our opposition got stronger and more organized as well. And so 1988 was the point where the Oregon Citizens Alliance developed the strength to actually do something. And this is where Gina comes in with her narrative.
Sure. Thank you, Robin. Yeah, so I think as I pick up where Robin has left off, I want to say a couple of things. One is that my lens on this history is very much connected to the work that I did at Basic Rights Oregon. And so it's from that perspective that I understand the late 80s and 90s as I came into the state in 92 and started to experience the dynamics here myself. I also want to give credit to Randy Blazak, who's the director of the Coalition Against Hate Crimes and whose work on the Oregon Citizens Alliance I relied on a lot for this history lesson. And you can find his work on the Oregon Encyclopedia. So picking up where Robin left off in the late 80s and 90s, this era of our history is really dominated by the Oregon Citizens Alliance, or the OCA, which was a conservative activist group and political action committee that rose to prominence in the late 80s as part of a national backlash against the gay civil rights movement. The OCA was founded by a number of folks. The most high profile of those include Lon Mabon and Scott Lively, whose names you'll hear throughout my remarks. Their first ballot measure, Measure 8 in 1988, was actually designed to overturn that executive order that Governor Goldschmidt had declared banning discrimination in state government based on sexual orientation. So they were able to reverse that by referring the executive order to the ballot, winning with 55.4% of the vote. And they really got the bug for ballot measures at that point. Beginning from the beginning, the OCA was not just focused on derailing the rights and dignity of LGBT people, but also on attacking abortion rights and immigrant communities. And of course, LGBTQ folks are impacted by access to abortion. They are members of immigrant communities and communities of color. And so I'll be interweaving, sort of that history to some degree as well. And we can also start to see the connections for the white supremacist groups today as the seeds of division and attack were sown by groups like the OCA here in our own state, 30 years ago. So the OCA came back in 1990 with Ballot Measure 10, which would have required parental notification before a minor was permitted to have an abortion. This time the measure was defeated, so they went down by 52.1% of the votes, and came back next with their largest campaign ever, which was Ballot Measure 9 in 1992. The measure would have amended the Oregon Constitution, excuse me, to quote unquote recognize homosexuality, pedophilia, sadism, and masochism as abnormal, wrong, unnatural, and perverse, end quote. It would also have prevented any quote unquote special rights for homosexuals and bisexuals. And that OCA rhetoric of no special rights for gays and lesbians, as opposed to framing the issue as civil rights or equal rights, gave them a much wider appeal. It was a pretty savvy kind of messaging approach. And the campaign in support of Measure 9 compared homosexuality to bestiality and to pedophilia. So essentially saying that the LGBT community was in the same category as, right? It also Measure 9 galvanized a coalition of folks opposing that measure from various faith communities, from communities of color, and of course from LGBT groups as well. So ultimately the measure was defeated by 56% of Oregonians voting against it. But at the same time, more than 638,000 Oregonians voted yes, which is sobering when you think about it. It was also a victory that came at a great cost. Oregon saw a wave of anti-gay hate crimes in 1992 during that campaign. It included the 2 murders in Salem, Oregon that were inspired by the OCA's rhetoric. Hattie Mae Cohen's, a 29-year-old Black lesbian, and Brian Mock, a 45-year-old white gay man, were killed in a firebombing in the fall of 1992. The 4 people charged in that crime were believed to be part of the racist skinhead subculture and network. And so we see echoes of murders like those of Ethiopian immigrant Mulugeta Sarah that happened in Portland in 1988. And we can start to draw a through line to the contemporary white supremacist movement in this country. In fact, one of Sarah's murderers was brawling at the Oregon Capitol just earlier this month on January 6th, having been released from prison in the early 2000s. He was a part of the insurrection in our own state capitol. After the defeat of Measure 9 in 92, the Oregon Citizens Alliance then targeted 28 small communities to pass local measures to remove the rights of LGBT folks. And they were successful in all but 2 communities. Just Corvallis and Gresham refused to take up the OCA's agenda. Ultimately, those local measures were overturned by the state legislature. They had to pass legislation that prohibited local laws that singled out groups of people on account of sexual orientation. And the OCA then responded with Measure 13 in 1994. So they came back to the ballot. The measure would have restricted public library access to materials dealing with homosexuality. And that measure failed. So 48.5% of the vote was garnered, meaning that the measure did not pass, but still way too close for comfort. I think the silver lining of the relentless public attacks was that the LGBTQ community got politically organized ahead of our communities in other parts of the nation, right? Robin spoke to the organizing that was happening at a community-based level of mutual support and mutual aid as folks figured out how to access culturally competent, safe, and welcoming resources for one another. And the early to mid 90s was really the time when folks were figuring out how to come out more publicly and how to take a stand to hold on to their very basic rights. This was not without significant personal cost, right? But we were able to build alliances across identity, across race, and across geography. For example, the Rural Organizing Project organized the 1992 March Against Hate from Eugene to Portland. where queer activists and supporters were publicly greeted by Oregon's Farm Workers Union, PCUN, and hosted at their Woodburn headquarters, which was an immensely brave act at the time by PCUN, and it went a long way in really destroying the wedge that the OCA was trying to drive between the LGBTQ community and the Latino community. There were many groups that would not be considered political that were also having a huge impact on changing hearts and minds in rural parts of the state. And I actually wanted to invite Reid to speak to this for a minute before I continue with a little bit more of this history. Reid?
Absolutely. Thank you, Gina. Yeah, in the early 1990s, the Portland Gay Men's Chorus and Portland Lesbian Choir joined forces, and we performed outreach concerts in several small towns around Oregon. We traveled by bus, and we were given strict instructions: do not walk around by yourself, stay in small groups, and even in those groups, be back indoors by dark if you can. In Coos Bay, we performed in the gymnasium of a community college. We set up a stage in the middle of the room. We had folding chairs for the audience. And as expected, there were OCA supporters picketing our concert when we arrived. They sat in the back of the room on the bleachers holding up their signs so we could see them as we sang. But as we sang, about half of them put their signs down. I thought they were tired of holding them and thought, well, they'll pick them up again when they leave, but they didn't. Our original goal in doing these concerts was to boost morale for those fighting the ballot measures while surrounded by the negativity of the OCA. When those folks left their signs on the ground, I realized we changed some votes in that election. Now, about 10 years later, Pendleton formed their first PFLAG chapter. PGMC did an outreach concert to support the chapter's formation. Only one business in town put up a flyer advertising the concert, and the chorus far outnumbered the enthusiastic audience. There were about 30 people. 5 years later, PGMC returned to do another outreach concert to support the PFLAG chapter. And this time, every business in town except one put up a flyer, and the place was packed. It was standing room only. After the concert, our director asked one of the PFLAG folks, well, what made the difference? And she replied, you did. And that's the power of what we do with music. Back to you, Gina.
Thanks, Reid. So in the timeline, we're up to 1996 now. There was a brief respite from the ballot attacks as the OCA failed to qualify yet another anti-LGBTQ measure that year. And Lon Mabon ran unsuccessfully for a US Senate seat that ultimately went to Gordon Smith. Basic Rights Oregon was formed in 1996 out of the leadership of previous organizations like the Portland Town Council and the Right to Privacy PAC, and also out of the leadership of folks who had been fighting those ballot measures so far for so many years. The community leaders recognized that it wasn't enough just to push back against the attacks year after year, but that we really needed a community hub to build political power and shift the culture, not just to hold on to the status quo, but to actively seek justice for LGBTQ Oregonians. So Basic Rights Oregon began to organize and build local teams around the state, and were ready in 2000 when the OCA sponsored a second Ballot Measure 9 that would have prohibited public schools in Oregon from encouraging, promoting, or sanctioning homosexual and bisexual behaviors. That measure failed again narrowly with only 47.1% of the vote, too close to 50%. Really too many votes, no matter what the number, but far too close to 50% for comfort. Something somewhat interesting happened following that 2000 campaign is that Lon Mabon spent some time in jail. He had refused to pay a settlement from a lesbian photographer who had been forcibly ejected from an OCA event in the early 90s. And by 2002, the courts were sick of chasing him, and he did some jail time. And so that really impacted how his leadership was accepted in the Republican Party and among others. So by 2004, Lon and the OCA's leadership were really out of favor with the Republican Party, Right to Life, and anti-immigrant organizations, all of which aligned to form the Oregon Family, through the Oregon Family Council, to create the Defense of Marriage Coalition and promote Measure 36, which amended the Oregon Constitution to define marriages between one man and one woman. So in 2004, Measure 36 was one of a dozen amendments on ballots around the country. The measure won in Oregon by nearly 57%, with over 1 million Oregonians voting to restrict marriage and deny that opportunity to their LGBTQ friends, family, and neighbors. And those dozen marriage amendments around the country, just about every single one of them passed that year in a coordinated national effort that was also aimed at mobilizing the Republican and right-wing voters to re-elect George W. Bush, which also happened that year. In the wake of that devastating loss, Basic Rights Oregon organized local leadership teams to actually work around local non-discrimination ordinances. And you see, at that time, the time that Oregon got swept up in that debate over marriage rights, we still didn't even have basic protections for LGBTQ people who could be fired, denied housing or public accommodations based only on sexual orientation or gender identity. And this harkens back to the bill that Robin mentioned that was first introduced in 1974. Here we are 30 years later, and there's still nothing at a statewide level that is protecting our community. So the vision that drove the founding of Basic Rights Oregon of turning from defensive fights to proactive victories really began to gain momentum during this time. So by 2007, 33 years after it was first introduced, there had been more than a dozen local non-discrimination policies that led to a legislative campaign and the passage of the Oregon Equality Act. That same year, the Oregon Family Fairness Act was passed. So we had the dual protections of ensuring that folks would no longer be fired, denied housing or public accommodations based on their sexual orientation or gender identity, and providing all of the rights and responsibilities for same-sex couples that come under marriage that the state controlled, but we were not able to ensure that the federal rights could be extended through the domestic partnership law because of that amendment from 2004. That year, thousands of people from across the state rallied and lobbied at the Capitol to make those victories possible. And we had legislative champions whose names I think you know very well today. At the time, Kate Brown and Jeff Merkley played pivotal roles in this effort. Of course, now our governor and state senator, US Senator. As I wrap up here, I'll say, meanwhile, Mabon and Lively attempted to revive the OCA in 2007 and place anti-gay measures on the ballot in 2008. They were unsuccessful in doing so. Another one of those connections to the circumstances with white supremacy that we find ourselves in today, we saw Lively, who was the author of The Pink Swastika. It was essentially a book blaming homosexuality on the atrocities perpetrated by the Nazis. He more recently promoted anti-gay legislation in Russia and Uganda. He's also the head of Abiding Truth Ministries, which has been listed as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. Unfortunately, others picked up the OCA strategy with local anti-immigrant activists. So we saw some local anti-immigrant measures that Basic Rights Oregon was able to team up with CAUSA and Rural Organizing Project to defeat. And building off of those multiracial coalitions, we were able to gather in 2009 to pass the Safe Schools for All Youth campaign, legislation that protects students against bullying. So I'll close by bringing us up to current times in terms of the progress that's been made between 2010 and 2020. The community with Bro in leadership not only deeply integrated racial justice and trans justice in the organization, but also led efforts to ban private insurers from excluding medically necessary healthcare for transgender Oregonians, removed barriers to changing gender markers on birth certificates, was among the first to provide an X option on state-issued IDs along with F or M, won the freedom to marry in the courts and of course across the nation, banned conversion therapy, and passed legislation providing model suicide prevention for all Oregon school districts. In December of 2020, the US Supreme Court turned away a challenge brought by Oregon parents to a school district's policy that allows transgender students to use bathroom facilities that match their gender identity. So the work continues even to this day, as we know. And this year, Basic Rights Oregon celebrates 25 years of fierce advocacy, remaining active in a robust multiracial progressive movement here in Oregon. And it's one of the largest state-based organizations in the country. With that, I think I'm gonna let Robin tell me who's next.
Okay, thanks, Gina. Uh, I've always been concerned with what was going on with the youth, because we're talking about what grown-ups were doing. They were organizing in bars. They were pulling organizations together. They were lobbying the legislature. And meanwhile, students in high school who read the same books and saw the same movies and watched the same TV and were, as the age of puberty, lowered, we had the high school kids who were just captive in their schools without resources unless they had sympathetic families. In the 1990s, even in the 1990s, teachers couldn't so much as put up a poster saying it was okay to talk to a counselor if you were queer or if you were gay. The counselors were prepared to talk to gay people. That happened in the Beaverton School District. So somebody put up a really innocuous poster saying exactly that it was okay to talk to a counselor. Somebody went home, told their parents, the parents complained, came back to school, the administration made them take it down. That by the late 90s, that was, we were beginning to see some slack cut there a little bit. In the early aughts, in the early 2000s in Multnomah County, Jim Clay, who was an assistant to County Commissioner Bev Stein, was able to get public health money earmarked for health clinics, for HIV screenings, health clinics generally, in the Portland public schools. And it was, at that time, it actually became okay to say gay in the schools. Of course, young people were coming out to their parents all the time. PFLAG Portland got its wheels under it sort of in 1977, and has always been a resource, ostensibly for the support group for the parents of gay kids, but there are a dozen or more PFLAG chapters in the state. Now, Reid will know exactly. And in some of the small towns in the state, I've been out to speak to some of those groups for GLAP, and in some of those small towns, it looks like PFLAG is one of the only queer outlets, period. And Reid, I wonder what you can tell us more about that.
Yes, thank you, Robin. Yeah, in 1977, two sets of parents, the Knapps and the Shepherds, founded Parents of Gays. Kristen Knapp and Susie Shepard, they're both friends of mine. They'd come out to their parents as lesbians not long before. And in 1982, there was a national network meeting in Los Angeles, and Parents of Gays became an official chapter of PFLAG, which had formed about 9 years before. Parents, families, and friends of lesbians and gays. In the early years, PFLAG was a haven for parents, and at that time it was a courageous act to join. Many people still believed being gay or lesbian was a mental illness or an issue of warped morality or an issue of warped family upbringing. And some people still believe this, but in the 80s, in the 70s, that was a mainstream view. So parents stepping up to support their children was an act of the parents coming out as well. Now, in my time with Portland PFLAG, I've met a lot of parents. Mormons, Republicans, Unitarians, atheists, Black, Mexican, rich, middle class, working class. Regardless of any of those demographic categories, they have one thing in common, and that's their attitude toward their children. Each one of them have looked at their children as individuals and not as little carbon copies of themselves. And they say to themselves, okay, now who are you? And how do I help you become the best you that you can be? And speaking as a therapist here, if everyone had parents like that, therapists would mostly be out of a job. In the 1990s, PFLAG took a really strong stance against the Oregon Citizens Alliance. Lon Mabon once said the only organization the OCA had no answer for was PFLAG. How can you challenge PFLAG on family values without looking like an idiot? And here's a story that illustrates that attitude that the OCA didn't have an answer for. In the 1980s, caller ID was not attached to most home telephones, and cell phones were the stuff of science fiction. There were certain requirements to form an official PFLAG chapter at that time, and one of them was you had to be willing to publish your name and your phone number in an ongoing ad in your local newspaper. One mom in small town Oregon did that, and she began receiving threatening phone calls, always from the same guy. She called the police and they attached caller ID to her phone. They found him and she took him to court. She won a monetary judgment against him, and she used the money to buy a beautiful full color banner for her new PFLAG chapter. And in the bottom corner, the banner read, "Paid for by," followed by the man's name. And that's the PFLAG attitude. You mess with their kids at your own risk. Now, PFLAG exists in tandem with other family or youth-oriented programs like GSAs in the schools, GLSEN, Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Educators Network. We recognize that LGBTQ youth thrive best when supported on various fronts, at home and at school. We also send volunteers for various functions at McLaren Youth Correctional Facility in Woodburn. Some of those youth are queer-oriented and may have gotten in trouble because they weren't supported in their identity, and they acted out as a result. When I was in grad school, I read a study that was trying to determine the highest risk point of adolescent suicide for those who identified as lesbian or gay. Trans wasn't mentioned in this study, but I think it's safe to extrapolate to that community as well, because I think it's true for them also. Researchers found the highest risk time was when the adolescent had realized who they were, but they hadn't told anyone. As soon as they started coming out, receiving just a little bit of support, the suicide rate began to drop. And by the time they told the important people in their lives, even if they didn't all support them, the suicide rate dropped to no more than any other adolescent. PFLAG parents understand this instinctively, the importance of support, and they'll support any organization whose focus is on LGBT youth. Now, PFLAG changed the name of the organization in 2014. Parents, Families, Friends of Lesbians and Gays became simply the acronym PFLAG. These days, nearly 3/4 of the parents who access PFLAG have trans kids, not lesbian and gay kids. Well, after the name change, I conducted a highly unscientific poll of friends of all ages, asking them simply, what does the acronym PFLAG stand for? I got a lot of variations, but no one got it exactly right. What they did all know is PFLAG is where I sent my parents. Another change we've noticed in recent years is the kids are coming out younger. Time was, folks didn't come out to their parents until they'd gone off to college. In some cases, going off to college made them realize for themselves who they were. But nowadays, with more mainstream representation, kids are able to see their identity reflected back to them at younger ages and realize who they are. So that's it for PFLAG.
Thanks. I was amazed a couple of years ago to be invited to do a tabling in a short presentation at a Gay Straight Alliance, and somehow I neglected to realize until I actually got there that it was a middle school, that I was dealing with people that were that young, and that's something that I really never thought I was going to get to see. I'll add, just for the historical purposes, that we finally got in Oregon, we finally got the Oregon Safe Schools and Communities Act in 2009. That is 39 years after gay people started organizing in Portland, giving kids the statutory, the actual statutory right to be safe in school and to organize gay straight alliances and to organize and do what the other kids did. Deborah, you're involved in the community right now. You've got taking the pulse of the community just from day to day, and I would like to hear what you have to say about the history of hate generally and how you're dealing with it right now.
Well, as I mentioned, I've been here since 1997. My very first and so far only door knocking was with Bro in the 2000 defensive campaign. in my time with the interesting thing about Pride has been celebrated in Portland since the early 70s. And Robin, you can specify which year, but the first outdoor March celebration was 75 or 76. And there's a lot of research that tells us that the sort of size and health of a community's Pride organization is indicative of that community's overall health and welfare in that area. And you know, in listening to all of this history, it's very apparent, that that Portland Pride has grown along with the progress of the community here, and they're very tied together. In particular, I want to point out that, as you know, Gina talked about all of the work building alliances and building you know, collaborations and all of that, and that's really reflected in the number of allied organizations that participate in and come to Pride every year. My first Portland Pride was actually not as part of Pride Northwest. I was a vendor in 2001, and it was not like that. It was, that's when, you know, there were protesters who walked through the middle of the festival. And as our community does, we have an amazing sense of humor. And this is the thing I see play out every single year, is that all of these, all of the hate that gets brought, which in all honesty has lessened over the years, has been without fail met by a lot of humor on the part of queer people inside Pride. Whether it's taking a selfie these days with someone with a hate sign standing outside the gate, or back in 2001 when some young folks out of the Smirk booth just tagged along with these protesters that were walking through the festival and basically mocking them. And I realize that sounds, I don't know, juvenile, but there is something really liberating about minimizing their impact and minimizing their intent, really. The thing that has happened with Pride, we receive threats of some kind every single year. No matter, without fail, some kind of threat is going to come. We don't always make it very public because safety becomes a significant issue and we need to be able to plan around that. And we don't always know where the threat's coming from, actually, in all honesty. It's not all coming from the same place, but we have responded to it by changing our processes, ensuring that we pay a lot of attention to security and all of those things. But the one thing we won't do is not be out. The Portland community, particularly with the support of our allies, becomes a force to be reckoned with. And I've noticed that the folks who threaten us, particularly the far, you know, we've talking about this connection to the white supremacy and this really sort of extreme groups, they're cowards, really, because they're going to target individuals. They're going to target a couple of folks off on their own, but they are not going to put themselves in front of a lot of us, and because they're afraid. And that has become really apparent to me, that Pride's original intent of our power in numbers and taking our place in the public sphere really serves that purpose of creating that space for us and not having to give it up, basically. So, you know, these days that we're in now, I think bring some, not necessarily new concerns, but some renewed vigilance, because because Portland especially, and parts of Oregon, but especially the Portland metro area, because we enjoy a more than typical level of support, particularly from our elected leadership and organizational leadership, we tend to get fairly comfortable. And I think right now we're not so comfortable because we are again having to pay attention to our surroundings, for example, and to who we're interacting with. And I'm very conscious of that. My wife works with at-risk youth and still has to go out every night, and they work overnight. And every day it's call me when you get there, call me when you're coming home, without a real expectation that something will happen, but not taking any chances either. Same way with our, we only have 2 staff, but we're conscious of each other when we're doing our jobs. Where are we at? What are we doing? Who are we interacting with? And it'll be interesting planning future when we're able to come back to large scale Pride celebrations. It'll be interesting to see what that looks like, and if there are concerns that we haven't had to actually deal with in a good while. I know that in 2020, when we had to cancel the Portland Pride Festival and Parade, our very first concern was, what does this mean to not be so visible anymore? What risk now sits on our individual community members to not have that power in numbers? Because when Pride is happening, it's considered to be the safest place in the city by the city. And so without that ability to come together and be really safe together, that was and is a significant concern for us around what does that mean for our community's ability to support each other. And I think Robin mentioned this, that the Portland LGBTQ plus community has always kind of struggled to come together as a whole. And Pride tends to be that one time where more of us do that than other times. And so when we don't have that space to do that in, I tend to worry about the long-term implications for the safety and the cohesion of our community as altogether. But as Gina mentioned also, when something happens, the community will come together in a heartbeat and get active really quick. The LGBTQ community here in this, especially in Portland, but in this region, voter turnout is 90-95% sometimes, 85 on the low end. So we're really active as people, but we have to stay vigilant in order to be able to maintain what we've gained and our safety together. So yeah. You're on mute, Robin. There you go.
All right. Now I'm not on mute. Yeah, it's time to wrap up. The interesting thing about LGBTQ history, when you sit down to study it, is that all of it is going on at once. All of it is still going on. So yeah, we are still trying to advocate for our rights. We are still trying to find our place in the community. Some of us are okay but as we see the breakdown of the gender binary, more and more people are coming out. Some things that we really wouldn't have thought of in 1970. Those people are still not safe. I'm following a court case right now. It's going on in Eastern Washington about some guys who invited one of their gay contemporaries to a party out at a ranch, killed him, buried him on the ranch. There are 5 people now who are charged with that murder, and the DA is trying to decide if it was a hate crime. A week doesn't go by in Portland that you don't see an ad on social media for a missing person, especially the trans people, young trans people. In the case with Kim Davis, the Kentucky, the county clerk who would not issue gay marriage licenses, her case was thrown out of court, but Alito and Thomas wrote the dissent, just definitely indicating that they intend to go after gay marriage as a federal right. They think that's, they think that's a novel right, which means that it's a, that somebody invented a right that actually wasn't in the Constitution, and they're going to try to kick it back to the states. In the Oregon legislature, or shortly before soon to come in front of the Oregon legislature is a proposal to eliminate the gay and transgender panic defense across the board for for murder or for any other crimes. It has always been the case that that you could beat up, somebody could beat up a queer guy and a gay guy and say, well, he came on to me sexually and I was so freaked out that that I had to beat him to a pulp. And that's just like folklore almost. And with the transgender community, with the transgender community, those folks are at risk in the same way. The state of Washington just eliminated the transgender defense for murder and for murders, and we're hoping that the Oregon legislature does likewise. The thing that I want to end with is that we have done really well in spite of all the hate that's thrown our way, and one of the reasons is that we have allies. We've always had allies. There are not enough LGBTQ, two-spirit, intersex, on and on. There are not enough sexual, or gender non-conforming people in society at large to ever win an election. So we've always had help, and we continue to have help. Certainly the case, you look at people like PFLAG parents who step up. The allies are all around us. They have gotten us by, so not everybody hates us, and a lot of folks stand up for us over and over and over. And that's how I want to end this discussion now. And I've got some questions here on this little, I don't know what's going to happen.
Robin, could I mention something?
Sure.
So first of all, that with the allies thing, I mean, it certainly the Jewish community of Greater Portland and across this state has been a tremendous source of strength and support for the LGBTQ community. I think we should be explicit about that in conversation with the Jewish Federation tonight. I also, I think it's worth mentioning that I spoke earlier about the history of anti-gay ballot measures really mobilized Oregon's LGBTQ and allied communities earlier than a lot of places. And we see that reflected in the fact that almost half of the states in the United States do not have non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ folks, and we still have no federal protections. And so I think not just on a local level, but nationally as well. And I know that one of the first questions in the queue actually does speak to the Supreme Court and whether, and Robin, you mentioned that. So I did want to mention that I do think there's been a bit more made of what the possible attacks on the freedom to marry in the US Supreme Court, given the conservative leaning, the way the court is so conservative leaning these days. It's true that Coney Barrett is a conservative Catholic. It's true that Alito and Thomas have really criticized the marriage ruling of 2015, Obergefell. But that certainly doesn't make a majority on the court. It also, I think, is important to note that there have been many decisions from this court that have upheld protections for LGBTQ people that are really give me optimism as well, including the decision, a 6-3 decision that LGBTQ folks are protected under the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and they really didn't have to find that. I think the last point that speaks to the how unlikely it is that the US Supreme Court would strike down Obergefell is that the myriad problems, it's a Pandora's box of complexity that opens up, right? Because there have been many countries that have followed suit, or even in recognizing same-sex couples. There are many states that preceded the decision at a national level. And so it would create a kind of a hornet's nest of complexity that I don't think this nation is, or the court is willing to wade into. I think what we're likely to see is more similar to what's happened with abortion access and with Roe, which is the right, they'll look for ways to hinder rights, not necessarily overturn the right itself. So you'll see we might see the chipping away of our ability to access public accommodations like wedding cakes and venues and those kinds of things, rather than overturn the decision wholesale.
Panelists, my friends here, can you all see the questions?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Click on that Q&A button down there. Joni Scheib's question is the first law to reverse discrimination against LGBTQ plus people in Oregon. Well, there are a variety of them at the city and county levels, but it all got rolled up in the Oregon Equality Act that was effective in 2008. I don't think there's anything more recent than that, except for the marriage decision in 2014.
Yeah, the more recent decisions have been in, let me see, I didn't have a timeline over here. The 2017 was when the legislation passed establishing the X gender marker on the driver's license for gender nonconforming folks. So you can now have an F, an M, or an X. And then the model suicide prevention law called Addie's Act was passed in 2019. So I'm not aware of any policy or legislation that was passed in 2020. And there may be, and I think you were mentioning, Robin, what might be coming up in the 2021 session. So those are the most recent examples.
And can I say something here as a trans person? When we start talking about LGBT, it's really easy to think or to kind of forget that what applies to LGB isn't quite the same as what applies to T. So for example, I changed my gender through the state quite a number of years ago. That means I was able to marry a woman in 2007 legally, but is it recognized at the federal level? Is it recognized at every state I want to go to? So the issues are a little bit different when you're talking about trans people. But we have common enemies. The OCA doesn't see any difference really between these different forms of identity. So it makes perfect sense to form alliances while at the same time remembering that we don't have exactly the same issues legally.
Okay. Yeah, Gina clicked. How do things look these days for queer people of color in Portland, especially youth? What we have discovered about our community, the LGBTQ community, is that we have the same problems with racism and some with sexism and one thing or another as the community at large. We are not generally any nicer about stuff like that. Groups have, over the years, depending on their culture and critical mass, probably just total numbers, have managed to elbow their way to the front of the line, get find their voices and speak out as groups, as individual cultures. The Latin community certainly has done that. The African American community has certainly done that. The Asian Pacific Islanders, who have been around but very quiet for years, suddenly in the last few years have come out with an incredible resource, very valuable to the community, and we hadn't heard from them for years before that. I would check in at Q Center. They are building a deliberately inclusive program over there. Problem is we're in a pandemic and we can't actually go places right now, but they're very conscious of inclusion of all kinds at Q Center, and they are available online or to answer your questions.
I can type a few organizations in for this answer too. There's a good Facebook page, Portland PDX Latinx Pride, which came out of the Portland Latino Gay Pride celebrations. There's Familia TQLM, which is a trans Latinx community organization for the transgender community. The Sankofa Collective is the kind of the new iteration of what was Portland Black P-Flag chapter that was formed 10, 15 years ago. And then there's an organization for trans and gender nonconforming folks called Black and Beyond the Binary. And those are or some of the kind of organizing homes that I'm aware of that are by and for LGBTQ folks of color. And I don't know if Deborah has anything to add to that from her networks.
No, I think those are the core. Some of those organizations are a bit more active than others, and the pandemic is definitely not helping that. But those I think are the best starting places to then branch out. Especially Black and Beyond the Binary is super active.
Okay, and Michelle asks, why does this presenter, Deborah, feel there is more risk today?
Well, we don't like to talk about it very much, honestly, but when it comes to, there's a tendency to assume that the farther left you go, the more accepting you're going to be of LGBTQ plus folks. And that's not necessarily true. So we're in this sort of interesting place in Portland where we have very active groups on both far ends of the spectrum, neither one of whom can be counted on to be a safe place for people like me to be, honestly. And so I am just, more cautious than I was before. And although, electoral politics may have gone a certain direction and this week, et cetera, it doesn't necessarily mean that what's been riled up will also go away with it. And so this kind of goes back to what I said about it's fairly easy to become complacent when you're in a place where you're not challenged as much as you might be in another place. But then we pay the price and have to go back on the defensive again because we're not proactively creating the spaces that allow us to flourish within the larger community. So it's sort of a combination of things that we expect to be safe in certain places because of assumptions we make about who's there, and it's not necessarily true.
Okay, and Daniel asked, would someone please talk about the role of the AIDS epidemic played in all of this? Who would like to speak to that?
Sorry, I know that within the choruses, it was a big deal. PGMC in particular was hard hit and was down to about 30 members by 1999 or 2000. And it was just really decimating the chorus. The chorus would perform at more memorial services every year by far than concerts, about 3 or 4 a month. And it really, that was part of the power of the choruses, though, was to support the community during that time. And that's one of the biggest differences between that epidemic and this one. We cannot support our community now through song. And that's a big deal because there's a reason choral singing originated in spiritual traditions. It really brings people together. Sharing the air in song is hugely powerful. So that's the community that I was most aware of being hard hit, but it just spread across the board. And here at the same time, we're fighting these anti-gay ballot measures. At the same time, we're watching people die. And it was just, you would think it would be a very depressing time, but it really brought us all together.
Yeah, I think it did. I can recall funerals every other week, you know, and of course people would die, and the families were ashamed that they had, you know, didn't want to admit that there was a queer in their family, and so they would list some other cause of death. But you knew what had happened. I really thought at the time that I would never forget the people who had died, but really there were so many of them I have lost count of the friends. It's like if you imagined everybody who was at your last birthday party, and this year half of them are gone. Half of them are dead. That's just the way it was. I was personally asked once not to attend, to leave a funeral I showed up for, simply because people knew I was out and they didn't want the presence contaminated by a gay person. But it did, you know, the community did rally around. The Reagan administration was so slow to do anything at all about vaccines or healthcare or one thing or another, that the community, there were benefits in bars, you know, and you know, benefits to help feed people who could no longer work. The lesbian community joined in to help take care, and we you know, we were able to pull together in ways that that sort of surprised me, actually. And I can recall, and just, you know, so angry. I can recall seeing a news conference on TV. At some point, they were talking about a very closed, very tight, small, contained neighborhood in New York City, which had more AIDS cases, the highest concentration of AIDS cases than anywhere else in the United States. And some cop described that on TV as a self-cleaning oven. And I thought, you know, is this the day I punch out my TV or what? You know, it was just, and everyone laughed about it. And there are pictures of the president and his cohorts laughing about AIDS at news conferences. It took nearly to the end of the Reagan administration before he even said the word out loud, let alone devoted any resources to it.
And the only reason he said the word out loud is because his best friend Rock Hudson came down with it.
Yeah, no kidding. But they denied him the care that he needed anyway. Yeah, it was one of those things where adversity did kind of make us strong. And, you know, you would hope to God that there's another way to be strong without going through that. But it made a difference for, you know, all of us in my age group. At least I'm 72 now. It was a major force in the community, and of course, major loss of so many of our people, but a way to bring us together as well. So I hope that answers that.
You're muted again, Robin.
Sooner or later, I'll figure out how this works. Was there a time when the local Jewish community didn't support LGBTQ people, and or a moment of change in when the Jewish community stepped up? I can't answer for the Jewish community. Rachel, can you speak to that?
Hi. Well, I can say for the most part within the Portland Jewish community and the liberal streams of Judaism and most of Judaism, it's been a pretty accepting community, and we can definitely talk more about that at a different time if you want to reach out to us via email.
Okay, thanks.
I do know that Jewish organizations have been part of Pride as long as I've been involved with Pride. I can't speak before that, but we're talking at least 14, 15 years in my engagement.
Yeah, I'm not aware, just dating back to the 90s with the ballot measures, I know that there were a lot of forums in the synagogues and a lot of, sort of course, co-sponsorship of educational events and those types of things. And so I'm not aware of a time when there had to be a reckoning or a convincing. And I will say that when we did really kind of double down on organizing among faith communities around the freedom to marry, which started in 2004 and a little bit before that probably, that a lot of the Jewish community leadership were anchors for that work. I remember doing a family portrait series that had portraits of LGBTQ families in different family formations and shared people's personal stories as a way of bringing more sort of visibility and support for family recognition. And that was something that toured the state and went through a lot of synagogues and so forth. So that's what I know of the relationship.
Okay, thanks. The next question, current relationships, security, cooperation between Portland Police Bureau and other local law enforcement and prosecutors and LGBTQ groups. Deborah, would you like to speak to that?
Well, it's complicated. Where do I want to start with that? It's complicated. We, as other folks have mentioned, the LGBTQ plus community is made up of pretty much any other community you can think of, right? So we're not all bound by everything that we have in common, and parts of our community have vastly different experiences than other parts. And the Portland Police Department has struggled with that, in all honesty, and they continue to struggle. There's lots of dialogue, there's lots of conversation. In some ways, the Portland Police Department and other law enforcement agencies have been super supportive of Pride through coming and participating, supporting their employees, etc. And then there's this complication of how the relationship looks outside of that limelight and in the real sort of lived experiences of people in our community. There's a super, super rough history between law enforcement and the LGBTQ plus community anywhere, really. And while there's been progress in a good number of areas, it still sort of sits tenuous most of the time because there hasn't been enough progress and enough change to really engender real trust and real mutual collaboration, respect, honesty, all those things. So it's sort of a living, constantly changing situation that stays edgy. Really?
Yeah, I just want to acknowledge, I think Hugo noted that white people have had a very different experience with police than people of color. That's absolutely the case. And for LGBTQ folks of color, the stakes, I think, are even higher in terms of that intersection of race and gender or gender identity or sexual orientation. And we know in all of the statistics around police violence, around and that type of thing, that our queer and trans folks of color in our communities fare the worst. So it's a really fraught dynamic for sure. I know that at Basic Rights Oregon, there's been some effort to be involved in police accountability measures. Partnerships with Don't Shoot Portland and those types of things have been happening over the last couple of years, but I haven't been directly involved in that, so can't speak to too many of the details. But it's a critical, issue as well.
Yeah, I'll say that when Tom Potter was chief of police and his daughter Katie was on the force, they marched in uniform in the Pride Parade, which was the very first time that had ever happened. And the police that were there as security turned their backs to Tom and Katie as they walked by. The police were, at that point, totally disapproving of that. Tom Potter did, in response to some community organizing work, Tom Potter did lay the groundwork for the Sexual Minorities Roundtable that met with the police department for years and years. That's the organization still exists. It's the Alliance for Safer Communities, called the Alliance for Safer Communities now. And it is an effort to reconcile some of the differences between the police and the community at large. But I imagine that dialogue is going to be going on. There's a certain amount of discussion about whether the police should march in uniform in the Pride Parade, and that's been an enormous sticking point. The police are generally unhappy about that, and of course, there are people, especially the trans kids in the community, who have earned their living with sex work or afraid of cops. They're triggered by cops. They don't like to see that. There's a lot of discussion that yet to be had about that, but there is still discussion going on. The parties are still talking to each other. The last question I've got here is, what about log cabin Republicans' views? And I'll just say that if you are a log cabin Republican, you have determined that something in your life is more important than your civil rights and the civil rights of the people around you. I really don't see how a person can vote that way, but yeah, that's my take on that. Anybody else?
Well, I just wanted to say to explain that log cabin Republicans are gay. gay or lesbian Republicans. And I agree with you. It seems oxymoronic to me. I did hear recently that the executive director of Log Cabin Republicans, I don't know if it was state or federal, actually resigned because they were going to support Trump for a second term in office. And I just thought, well, good for you for standing up. But I don't see how anyone can take that view either.
Yeah, Deborah, anybody else?
I'm just not gonna, it's there, again, we go back to the reality that the LGBTQ plus community encompasses every single other community there is. There is no such thing as the community, really, which is why things are so complicated. And it's periodically difficult to come together unless we're under attack. Because we're very different people with very different, all those things. And, you know, the Log Cabin Republicans are just an example of that, really.
Dang, Deborah, that was a way more, that was a way better response than my mama told me if I can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all response.
Well, yeah, it's hard to say something nice about that, but we've come to the end of our questions, and we have come to the end of our allotted time. We finished this business in with 2 minutes to spare. Actually, it's 8:28 now. We thought we'd go to 8:30. Does anybody on the panel here have anything they want to add before we sign off?
I just wanted to respond to something Deborah said earlier about the religious right being at Pride and a presence. I went to the first Pride Parade ever in Roseburg in 2019, and those folks were there and very prominently. And the funniest thing I've seen in a long time was a guy following them around holding a sign that with an arrow that said, "Never misses a gay event." And it was just hilarious because it took the wind out of their sails and no one could really take them seriously after that.
Exactly.
Laughter is a real good way to fight those folks.
I just want to thank the other panelists. It was good to work with y'all on this, and thank everyone who joined us to listen in, and hope that it's been a good experience for y'all.
Yeah, I'm happy with the event. I'm happy with the amount of history we were able to teach and the personal stuff we were able to share at the same time. So and thanks for the folks who typed in their questions. It's neat to see these. Neat to see this spooling out here on the right side of my screen. If that's all we've got to say, then I'm going to hand it back to Rachel, who will probably want to remind us about the next programs.
Yeah, thank you again. Thank you all of you for presenting tonight. We look forward to hopefully seeing you in February and March, and again for our summit in May. Again, you can head to www.jewishportland.org/uncovering for the recording from tonight. It'll be up tomorrow, and for registration for future webinars and to see previous recordings. Have a great evening. Thank you. Good night.